We're going to talk about, I guess, work versus personal tech, what you carry, whether it's work, personal, combined, whatever it is. But before we get into the specifics of that, I guess we should probably put a disclaimer out the front that there's no right answer here, and I know you've probably come to get like a definitive answer on what works or whatever, or some specific recommendation. But the question you have to ask yourself right at the beginning is, what am I doing every day, and what am I doing with these devices? So I guess to start it off, the original question that you posed to me is like, why would you have a separate personal phone to a work phone when there's dual SIM options available and you could just carry one phone around the whole time? Which again, perfectly legitimate question. And although I gave you the answer of what suits me, that doesn't necessarily mean that scenario couldn't fit somebody else's setup, because it depends entirely on what they're doing. Now, just briefly, my reasoning was I want the two worlds to be separate. The two Georges can't collide here for me, so to speak. So I've got my setup, because there's multiple devices and I don't want work anywhere near it. It also, I think, in my own headspace makes sense, because if all work is on my work supplied devices, then it doesn't invade my mindset when I'm not at work, kind of thing. So, but then there could be another argument where, if you don't do much tech or do much stuff outside work, for instance, that requires a lot of tech, maybe you just can get by with a phone. I guess there's an argument there that you could combine it all.
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right, and I think it comes down to device. Obviously, you don't really want to use a work laptop, for instance, for personal, or recreational computer usage. Phones are an interesting one. I actually stopped to think about what you said, and bearing in mind both of us have iPhones, and separating your iPhone from your work world is actually quite difficult, because you would have to have a separate sign in anyway to manage that, which would mean that you'd have to have a second account, Apple account for work, and they don't really coexist that well in the in the Apple ecosystem. So it's much better just to have a simple device that's separate, rather than accounts, I think, within the Apple world that you'd switch between. But having said that, I mean, my Sony phone, which I had a while back now, actually you could swap accounts. So you could, on the same phone, you could quite easily have an account for work that was quite separate to your personal account. And that was actually one of the few seamless things in Android that actually worked reasonably well. So I think, we have to consider ecosystem. But as you say, there's a fine line switching off notifications, I guess, if you go on leave or whatever, or otherwise you're prisoner to work.
And I guess, it's also how your works IT is set up as well. So, mine, I think, is a bit restrictive. So it actually installs policies on the actual iPhone itself, and that's got to do with security, maintaining security matters. So a standard thing for a work laptop is that it automatically locks itself and goes to sleep after a certain amount of minutes. If you happen to forget your duty of locking it before you leave the desk, for instance, and they actually install something similar on the phone that actually gets it to auto lock after, I think, a maximum of 2 minutes. Now, for me, that doesn't work, because on my personal phone, I don't actually use that function at all. I switch it to never switch off, and the reason for that is because I always know to switch it off when I'm not using it, but I use it differently. So there's logistical matters like that. And then I have other concerns around some of the installed apps that you would be putting on there. Again, it's because of the fact that I don't imagine it would be too much of an issue, but I'm just concerned that the fact that it's there coexisting with some of your personal stuff as well. And again, the two Georges can't collide as far as I'm concerned when it comes to that sort of stuff. But again, it depends on what you need and how it works, and what works for you. Because it could be that your entire tech environment is just at work. And you may only need to pick up your phone outside of work, maybe to just check the odd thing or whatever. If you're truly not someone that engages with tech, on a personal level. Again, that doesn't work for me because I've got it's almost like a hobby because I play around with all these things all the time. So I want like a whole separate environment, like I'm being my own IT department for my own devices, kind of thing. And that's the kind of thing that you really have to kind of bear in mind when you're sorting through a lot of these questions: is what am I actually doing in that regard?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know if Apple's ever considered it. Maybe it is actually possible on Apple. I don't think it is to switch between accounts really freely. What I found on the Sony, even though at the time it wasn't much of a work sort of issue for me, was you could configure the other account to have your personal account to have the right amount of work functionality, which might just be an email, work email, for instance, just so you can keep an eye on things. But in the second account, you could basically configure that 100% for work or not for work at all. And it was really quite seamless to move between the two accounts. That'd be great with Apple. And then if you combine that with having two numbers attached to a phone that are visible through either account, because you can configure that, then you can control that. But at the moment, you're absolutely right. There's very little control, and even if you do use your work phone for work purposes, you hardly want to be doing your browsing or et cetera, or scrolling through your socials. Even if it's your personal phone, but if you're using it for work. So it is a very tricky balance to get right. And I don't know that we've ever got that quite right for mobile devices.
The one last thing I wanted to mention before we get on to video editing, as it pertains to this topic as well, is you don't really have a choice. What depends on how liberal your IT department is at work too. And I guess we're talking about knowledge workers here and information workers specifically, because obviously there's a whole lot of other jobs in the economy that don't relate to having to use a tech device specifically, although it's getting harder and harder. But the last thing I would say is that you're depending on how much choice they give you, you may not just get a choice in what you're given. For instance, I'd have to check for sure, but I know on my end, I think you only will get an iPhone, for instance. And that, I think, has largely got to do with, an IT department, especially for a larger organization, is going to want stability and dependability, and also an environment that they've tested to the nth degree that to satisfy their requirements that it's not going to break. And then they just stick with that option for years, and they won't deviate from it. So again, like for instance, if the offer is they give you an Android phone, for instance, then it might be easy to do what you're suggesting. But if you've got no choice and they only give you an iPhone, then there's not much you can do about that, really.
Absolutely. And then you effectively you get pushed to the two devices, which as you say can be perfectly well managed, but it's not always ideal.
And again, it can also apply to things like the types of laptops they give you. So, the personal tech I've got is all Apple based. And predictably through an organization, through work, I've got a Windows laptop, and that's fine. I like using Windows just fine, but that's an example of where the two wouldn't go together because you've got two different ecosystems going on there.